Hello, good evening, and welcome to another BSHAA webinar. This BSHAA webinar is titled Clinical Governance, Improving Your Practice. My name is Raul Garcia Medina. I'm a council member, and the person who is going to be presenting this webinar is our Chief Executive, Professor David Welburn, whom I'm sure you all know. What we don't know so much about him is the fact that his professorship is actually in governance, which very much relates to the topic at hand. Some housekeepings to go through. Please feel free to ask and pop your questions in the questions section on your right-hand side. If you think your bandwidth isn't coping with the data, do try and turn the video camera off. And just allow the slides to appear on your screen. That may speed up the process. And finally, the 3 questions at the end. That's just part of the actual feedback questionnaire. If you don't submit those questions tonight, you will get a reminder in 2 days, and then in a week's time. Without further ado, I'll pass the microphone over to David Welburn. David, over to you.
Thanks, Raul, and good evening and welcome to everybody. Just a very quick overview of, now that would be helpful if that actually worked. So why is my slide, oh, there we go. So you should now have the outline of what I'm going to be saying. So a very brief introduction about clinical governance as a starting point, and then I'm actually going to take a step back from clinical governance and talk about governance, which obviously is a subject that I'm more qualified to talk about, given that I'm not a clinician. But I'm going to talk about it in a way that is about illuminating the significance of governance and treating it as something that, if you get to grips with it, is a real liberator and an enabler. And far too frequently, governance is seen as a dusty old process-dominated area, and that, in my opinion and experience, largely comes from people who don't actually understand governance and try to blag about it, as opposed to ones who genuinely understand what it's all about. And I'm going to try and illustrate for you and give you some insight from a bunch of different directions as to why governance really is a liberator and enables you to do the right things, and then from that aspect of governance move on to what you can learn from the world of corporate governance and how that applies, and then talk specifically about some aspects of clinical governance. But let's just begin, and I promised that I'd start with clinical governance, and if you look in a variety, if you Google it, if you look in a variety of sources, something very close to this definition is what comes up when you look at clinical governance. Almost invariably, web content on clinical governance talks about the NHS, doesn't recognise that it's much wider than the NHS, and it harks back to a statement by Sir Liam Donaldson. Not sure if he was a Sir in 1998, but he was certainly the medical director for the NHS, as it was in those days, as distinct from NHS England. But the key message from that definition of clinical governance is that it's a framework through which NHS organisations are accountable for continuously improving quality of service, safeguarding high standards of care, by creating an environment in which excellence in clinical care will flourish. A whole bunch of things in there, and basically I spent a number of years in the NHS, and I got frustrated with the fact that if one word will do, it's always helpful to use 10. And so I basically wanted to come back to the point that clinical is actually too important to be appropriated by the NHS for its own use. And let's just look at what that means. The important things here: it's a framework, it's about accountability, it's about quality, it's about safeguarding high standards, and it's about excellence. Could have highlighted the word flourish in there, because there is something really vibrant and positive about something that is not languishing, it's not It's not about just making do. It's actually about something which is taking you onwards and upwards. But just separating out a whole bunch of those words, because the important words are there that I've highlighted in that statement. And I'm going to come back time and again to why those are the important words. So that was just my brief introduction to kind of set the scene and to say, and indeed, if you look and Google clinical governance, you get a whole bunch of stuff out there, much of which is kind of designed by people who talk management speak rather than reality. I know you could probably accuse me of that from time to time, but I want to get to the heart of what it's all about. So this is the origin of governance here. We have a trireme. I think it's a trireme. Basically, a trireme is 3 rows of rowers in a ship. That was used for all sorts of purposes. If you look in detail, you get quadriremes and quinquiremes as well. But the trireme is the most well-known, originally Greek, subsequently Roman as well. And the fascinating thing is that when you look at a bunch of images that you can capture on them, almost all of them show the sail blowing in the wrong direction for the rowers, but that's a separate issue. But it becomes an important issue when we're looking at governance. So moving to more up to date, the America's Cup, one of the coxers from the America's Cup. And what's all this got to do with governance? Well, kybernetes is the Greek for a steersman, the person who was in command of the trireme, and gubernante is the Latin for the person who was in charge of the ships. So what I hear you say, don't despair yet. There's a lot of value in this, because kybernetes, the Greek, leads you directly to cybernetics, the science of control systems, and gubernante, governance, is the systematic control and exercise of authority, is one definition for governance. And if you are aware of the American midterm elections coming up in a couple of weeks' time, you'll be aware that the term used in America is gubernatorial, closer to the Latin, for the election of state governors. So the whole process of and cybernetics, 2 completely different words as we think, but they're not. They are both about how you systematically implement control of systems. I'm always wary of using the word control, because in complex systems, it becomes impossible to control things. You can only influence things, but control is one of those words that you have to use in this context. So what's all that got to do with it? Well, I've got to take a moment to recognise that last year Cambridge won the Oxford and Cambridge race after a long series of not winning. But you'll see here we have a modern equivalent of the trireme. We have the 8, and we have the tiny little cox, as lightweight as possible, in control of 8 burly individuals, and they only cox is the person who is commanding and harnessing the power of the engine room, so to speak. So let's look at the gubernante and the governance and the steersman and the cox. Why is this helpful? Well, as you go back to the 8 there, it's patently obvious. And when you watch the tactics and strategy of the boat race and the importance of the tossing the coin and winning which side of the river bank you're on, the gubernante, the cox, the steersman, the governance of the system is all about setting direction, and it is through the demands and the commands from the cocks that the power of the whole engine room is properly harnessed towards the rivers, get up that river as fast as possible. The cox is the only person facing forwards and always faces forwards. In other words, they are the person who knows where and sees where and manages the steerage to make sure that they reach the destination. They are skilled and experienced. They have to be agile and adaptable, and you see that time and again as the oars starting to lock in and the tide starts to take control. They have to be able to adjust and nudge the direction in order to achieve the goals. They are responsible for the outcome of that race. In the case of the 8, they are highly trusted and they are accountable. And every single one of those is a statement about the importance of governance. And just for a moment, I want to go back to explain some of those in the context of the Greek or Roman triremes. Now, supposing that the ship, which was put in the charge of the day, was a war vessel, which often they were. And the whole of civic society was dependent upon and put their trust in and allocated all of their resources and their power and their energy and their skilled fighters and so on. They put them all in the hands of the gubernante, and they trusted that the gubernante would take that ship, that fighting force, into the midst of the battle and prevail through their appropriate skill and experience and adequately harnessing the power and managing their agility and so on. And they would be utterly accountable to the whole community that they were serving, and the community's future was entirely dependent on the effectiveness of the gubernante in that trust and that responsibility. So in the military context, the gubernante was a force to be utterly reckoned with. Move on into a different context, which may be a trading context, and certainly you move to the sort of 16th, 17th centuries, perhaps, no longer called the gubernante, no longer the triremes, but in the early days of merchants and when Europe was at its height in the world because of its forces of and its trading perspective, then the person in charge of the ship was also entrusted with the entire fortune of the owners of the ship and the cargo that they were entrusted with. And the future of the people who'd invested in the ship, who were buying the cargo, their futures were entirely placed in the hands of the modern day, in those days, gubernante, and understanding how to manage the trade winds, how to set the direction and navigate through the violent storms on the one hand and the pirates on the other hand. And so they were responsible for, in just the same way as the military gubernantes were responsible, they were responsible for the successful trade and future prosperity of communities and nations even. So governance, the origin of governance, being the steersman, being the one who is setting the direction, facing forwards, adjusting and adapting as forces rage against them, understanding how to achieve the goals and interpret those goals as they need to change and adapt, and being utterly accountable for success, sets the entire definition of governance. And it seems to me that actually understanding the origin there and understanding how significant each of these elements is in achieving future prosperity and success and survival even is something not to be ridiculed as being irrelevant. It's absolutely at the heart of a meaningful governance. So, end of history lesson, let's move on and let's talk how that translates into corporate governance. I'm just checking out. We'll move on. There haven't been any questions posed yet, as I see at the moment. So let's move on and see how we can learn from that. Come back to, well, here is the definition. My preferred definition for governance overall: set of structures, processes, and relationships within which decisions are made, resources deployed, accountability is managed in order to achieve the agreed purpose. You can, when I talk about corporate governance, and I relate corporate governance to history and to the lessons that we need to learn about clinical governance, you compare this statement with the definition from Sir Liam Donaldson, and you will see a huge overlap. And one of the things that's really, really important to understand is that governance has indeed got consequences. At its heart, it defines clearly how decisions are made, and equally significantly, who has authority to make them. And when you look at failures of governance often occur when there is no clarity on how decisions are made, and people argue over who has authority, or even make decisions for which they have got no authority. And then consequences come. Governance also ensures full accountable outcomes, and those outcomes arise from exercise of that authority, and accountability rests with individuals, and accountability is to individuals and collective groups. And it's not possible to escape from the fact that accountability has to rest with individuals. And confused accountability, shared accountability, are words that are only ever used by people trying to get out of their own responsibilities and accountabilities, pass the buck on to someone else, or fudge. There is no way that in good governance people can duck their accountability, but they do. And governance sets the relationship. This one's more complicated. It sets the relationship between freedoms, boundaries, and consequences. Now, what do I mean by that? Governance is actually about creating freedom. It's not about setting rules. It's about saying what you can and can't do. It's about saying, here is the domain within which you are accountable for what happens. You make the decisions about what happens. You deploy the resources as to what happens. And you are free within certain circumstances as to how you do that. The circumstances are all defined by the boundaries, what you're not allowed to do, the line that you must not cross over, and so on. Governance has more to do with freedom than it has to do with constraints. But at the edges of every freedom is a boundary or a constraint. And there have to be consequences. There is a consequence for crossing the boundary, crossing the line, abusing the freedom, seeking to apply freedom where you don't have. And we see that. We see those things happening time and again. But failures of governance are about lack of maintenance of the boundaries and the consequence, and lack of exercise of proper freedom, which gives people the accountability and the space. Now, again, this is definitions applied in corporate governance, but it's absolutely true in terms of your clinical responsibilities and accountabilities and freedoms that we'll come on to in a moment. I was putting a research proposal together to look at how power, both formal and informal power, are exercised as part of governance. Actually, one of the most simplistic expressions of governance is that it is controlling the exercise of power. And almost everything is, in governance terms, is about the power and how you use it, how you exercise it, and how you are accountable and it's controlled and so on. So like that kind of martial arts environment seems to be a much better illustration of power in that sense, because it's not the ones who have the most power who win. It's the ones who are best at controlling precisely how they exercise the power that's in their gift. And that's a really important lesson too. I promised that to myself that I wouldn't do it, but actually you've got to mention Trump at this point and his completely illiberal use of power and abuse of power. But anyway, carry on. And there is only one overriding principle for the whole of governance, and that is that no one and nowhere in the system can be allowed to have unfettered power. And if you look at governance failures, they all arise when power does not have appropriate constraints upon it, the fettering of it. So, for instance, the structure of corporate boards in which you have a chair and a chief executive and independent directors, non-executive directors. The structure is such that the chair and the chief executive, in principle, have different power and different responsibilities, and the one acts as the conscience and the constraint on the other, and you end up with proper constraints and controls on the power and its use. And of course, you've got to come back to the familiar statement that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely, which is the corollary of that message that you must not allow unfettered power. You must not allow absolute power anywhere in the system. There have to be constraints, there have to be counterbalancing forces. And if we look historically at failings in governance, and I have to say, one of the reasons why my forehead is shining so brightly when I look at the lights in my study on the camera, if you're looking at that, lip service to accountability is the one thing that makes me tear my hair out more than anything else. People choose to make commitments to accountability when it suits them, and then when it ceases to suit them, they find alternative approaches, usually when things are getting a bit hairy, and that's precisely the point at which accountability is even more important. Other failings: chaotic, confused systems, not being clear from the outset, having different understanding at different parts of the system. You've got individuals with unchecked freedoms is a substantial failing. There's power imbalance, and where someone who has supposedly got countervailing forces involved to prevent them abusing their power, but those systems, those safeguards that are put in place are riddled with fear because of their power and authority. And I guess you kind of start to think about some of the stories like Weinstein, for instance, where absolutely everyone in the system accepted what he was doing because his power and influence was so huge that those who ought to have known better and stopped him were afraid and too weak and knew they would be ignored. And you see it time and again in society. Power cartels, Probably the best example of this, some of you are probably too young to understand, to be aware, but the collapse of Enron, for instance, going back a ways, Enron collapsed because there was a circle of power in which A was accountable to B, and B was accountable to C, and C was accountable to D, and D was accountable to A. And you get a cartel in which you can all nod through failings in the system because it's in your interest to do that. And also in Enron, the regulator weakness, the regulator was actually colluding, the financial authorities were colluding with the collapse. And I guess the best example of that is in the subprime mortgage collapse of the financial systems, where weakness of the regulator and complacency of the regulator prevented anyone from spotting that the foundations were incredibly porous. And you've got misplaced trust, and you've got outdated cultures. And all of these, most of the examples that you can cite, high-profile examples, are in corporate governance, system governance, but actually they all apply in the clinical arena too. And you know, again, the misplaced trust sits there with, and an example might be all of the stories that are emerging regularly in the news about relationships within certain religious structures, where it was always assumed that nobody in particular faith would ever abuse the system, and so they were trusted because of who and what they represented, and yet that turned out to be just as much smoke and mirrors as the poor regulation in some areas. And indeed, cultures that accept certain risks which are no longer acceptable, outdated cultures, all of these are sources of governance failings. What do they have to do with clinical governance? Again, of course, I want to keep asking that question, that actually all of these can be sources of failure within clinical systems when people, let's look at the misplaced trust again, and one would come straight back to Dr. Shipman, wouldn't you, and others around, and so on. And all of them occur when governance is not properly in place because assumptions are made which prove to be faulty. Just for completeness, I'm not going to go through this, but every single time there's been a major systematic failure, there's been a review of corporate governance, and high-profile names have reported and changed governance and tightened governance, and they've all patted themselves on the back and assumed everything was okay, and then sat back until the next failure occurred. So it's just there for reference if you want to use the slides afterwards. One of my other frustrations about governance is that it's very difficult to get people to talk about governance in anything other than process terms. And yet it is always failure of relationships and power relationships between people and individuals and people that make governance fail. Very rarely is it processes that fail. Processes usually work. It's the people operating the processes who either through fraud or through incompetence just don't understand how they are meant to be implementing those processes. And all discussions of governance, majority of discussions about governance, start very strongly looking at process and fail to look at relationships. And this is especially true in clinical governance, that your relationships and the people to people, people do deals with people. How they use the processes is kind of a secondary issue. People do business with people, people deliver care to people, and so on. It's the relationships that you've got to watch out for. I'm going to put one last bit of theory in before moving on, and this is a very, very, very underrated but important piece of management science. Mark Moore, a professor at the Kennedy School in Harvard Business School, published a very, very important piece of work about the strategic triangle which has always been applied to public sector goods. And goods there has both meanings. Goods as in the delivery of processes, but goods as in things that are about betterment. And if you happen to work in the commercial world, good is usually defined in terms of tangible measures of profitability, return on investment, and so on. Even if you go into a much more altruistic world, when you start talking about not only economic return on economic investment, but return on social investment and return on environmental investment, you're still talking about measures that are tangible. When you're talking about public services, when you're talking about healthcare, when you're talking about social consequences, it's really quite difficult to measure success in that terms. And Mark Moore produced a fantastic model for how to determine what should look like. And remember that governance is all about having your processes and systems that assure you of success.
Let's see.
Yes, it's there.
Yes, I can.
Now I've opened the right windows. Okay, so carrying on. Sorry, folks. Humble apologies for messing that up. I'm going to close my webcam so that I'm not using as much bandwidth. I'd started talking about the strategic triangle, and the most important, the beginning element. This is Mark Moore looking at things of social value, public services, and so on. Public value proposition, what matters not just to you, not just to the financial people, but what matters to the society that you're representing. What's the uniting purpose that is valuable is the first pillar of the triangle. The second pillar of the triangle is, if only we can get it working again. The second pillar of the triangle is the operational capability, which is really about saying, doesn't matter how altruistic you are, how optimistic you are about what you'd like to achieve, what you're capable of achieving is fundamentally important too, what's practically possible. And you've got to balance those two. And then the bit that most people don't adequately take account of, it seems to me, and it's increasingly important in a world in which social media and other forces are at work, is you can only do what you've got political and regulatory and public acceptance you can do. So the authorizing environment, what permission do you have? And it doesn't matter what you'd like to do, if you don't have public support and commitment to it, you'll fail. And many failures of system and governance are about people trying to do the right things with the public value proposition, having all the resources in place, but not acting.
David, lost your voice again.
Regime, the value proposition, the operational capability, and we now turn this into a governance picture, then the value proposition is what we should do, the operational capability is what we're able to do, and the authorizing regime is what we're allowed to do. And allowed is not about permission only, it's about public consent and public acceptability and political acceptability and so on. And so effective governance, as distinct from governance, does depend on the set of structures, processes, and relationships, and so on. But actually, that authorizing regime sets the where the accountability needs to come. And then, actually, if you look at if you focus inadequately, if you don't have balance across the triangle, and you've got you're trying to do the right thing and you've got the skills and capability to do the right thing, but you don't have the authorizing regime. That to me is the maverick world. If you have the value proposition and the authorization and consent to do it, but actually you're conning yourself on your operational capacity, that's your hubristic section. And if you have the authorizing regime and the operational capability, you just get on and do it irrespective of whether it's the right thing to do. That's the unprincipled world, the cads of this world. And then, of course, the bit in the middle, which is where you've got real balance between authorization, doing good stuff, doing it well, and doing it with consent is all about the integrity of governance. Now, when we get into this space, it actually applies much more effectively to clinical governance than it does to organizational governance. And so this forms a significant pillar for us moving forwards. Quickly relating back to that single statement, which you've seen before, and I like sometimes to sort of put it in the vernacular, and relationship structures and processes are your starting point. Those are the set of things you've got to have. You make decisions, you take action, and you deploy all of your resources to achieve towards the agreed outcome. And you put accountability across all of that, totally across all of that. And then you've got two things that you have to do together. It's what you do and the way in which you do it. What and that ethos, the stuff and the style. And coming back to the point time and again, it's not about the what on its own, it's about the way, the manner in which you do it, and the integrity and the values and all of that great principled stuff. So the stuff that you do and the style with which you do it, all important. That's one picture of governance. Another similar picture: purpose, direction, rules, and tone. And why I put tone in there, tone at the top. An organizational culture is defined by the way all its organization sees the behavior and principles of the very top people in the organization. Doesn't matter what you say, if you don't actually behave in cognizance with what you say, they'll believe what they see, not what they hear. So rules and tone, purpose and direction, all the pillars of where you are going. And there's a group at the top there: vision, values, policy, strategy, leadership, culture, all that kind of what you do, a declaration of what you want to be, what you want to do, how you want to be seen. And sitting alongside that, you've got assurance, probity, accountability, transparency, stewardship, all good behavioral things that are about a demonstration of how others see you, being able to see yourself through the eyes of others. And governance is about setting the scene of what you, being very clear about how you want to be viewed by others, and then taking the time to look at the way others are actually seeing you, not the way you're telling them you want them to see you, but the way they're actually seeing you. So all of that drives success, and the final bits of governance are about defining success and proving it, measuring it. Again, very similar to the last one, just little elements that are all part of the story. And governance is actually about being self-aware. And so if you're going to measure, if you're going to be self-aware, you've got to measure it. So going back to that last slide, your intent, it's your declaration of what you want to be, how you want to be seen, your brand, if you like. You've then got to measure it. You've got to gather some evidence that says, do I truly understand how others are looking at me and my organization, not just how I'm telling them they should look at me? Is there a gap between the intent and the evidence? Are they aligned? And if not, here's my improvement. So if you're going to be self-aware about governance, about clinical governance, these are the kind of areas that you should be looking at. Are you clear about what you are? Are you looking at yourself through the eyes of others? Are you spotting the difference between the two and acting to close the gap? Very simple. And there's 4 slides here that you'll get afterwards that actually give you some actions to put in place, some checklists to put in place around each of those 4 sections. Conscious that we lost some time in the middle there and I need to move on, so let's move on into the clinical governance world and the so what of all I've just talked about. How does that apply in the world of audiology? How do we translate, how do we build the bridge between the triremes and your day-to-day practice? Coming back to the clinical governance, the statement of NHS view, and if you look online for evidence of what clinical governance is all about, you'll see pictures right, left and centre of 7 pillars in a Greek temple with patient-professional partnership or something equivalent to that at the top. That's your goal. You're trying to build from the foundations of systems and team working and communication, ownership, leadership, etc., through all of these 7 domains to achieve a fantastic patient-professional partnership relationship. And all the clinical governance text around NHS clinical governance talks about these 7 pillars of effectiveness: clinical effectiveness, risk management effectiveness, patient experience effectiveness, communications effectiveness, resource effectiveness, strategic effectiveness, and learning effectiveness. I get slightly frustrated at this point because governance is about accountability. And although in practice, a good organisation that's taking clinical governance seriously within the NHS, absolutely hot on accountability, all the language and the words are not about accountability at all, because it feels a bit too business-like. But actually accountability is the totality. It's about being accountable for clinical outcomes. It's about being accountable for understanding and managing risk, appropriate risk. Remember that risk is not something to eliminate, it's something to manage, and it's something to choose which risks are appropriate and to eliminate those risks that are not. Risk is positive as well as negative, patient experience, and so on. So I come back time and again, we are accountable. Accountability is at the very heart of clinical governance. So if you see a document on clinical governance and you want to follow it and it doesn't mention accountability, tear it up, throw it away, because it is useless. It is entirely about accountability and making sure you understand accountability and can act on your accountability and can smile and hold your head high when you are being accountable for what you are doing and how you are doing it. And there is no doubt NHS accountability flows from the organisation, the structure and supervision. Certainly in audiology that's the case. Accountability flows from the organisation, the team structure, the supervision, the role of the Care Quality Commission to oversee the organisational quality, the role of NHS improvement to oversee the financial integrity of the NHS organisation. The regulation is about the organisation, not about the individuals and the professions. For a hearing aid dispenser, there is a fundamental and utterly different perspective in which you need to understand clinical governance. Your accountability flows from your HCPC regulation that authorises you to practice autonomously as a professional. It's all about you, not the organisation. So this is partly why I've spent quite a bit of time talking about governance as a whole, because it's about you, the hearing aid dispenser, the audiologist, the regulated audiologist. It's not about your systems, your processes, it's about you, the individual. If we go back to the 7 pillars and you put it in the context that it's not about being accountable to the organisation, it's about you being accountable as a professional, as a regulated professional that's authorised to practice. Your clinical accountability must be measured through focus on best possible outcomes. Your risk management accountability is through disciplined awareness, ownership and assessment of risk, and communication of risk and sharing the risk with your clients, patients, whatever you want to call them. The patient experience is about empathy and understanding and listening and engagement And boy, do I come across this time and time again, that the engagement with your client, you know more than I do, but I see it all the time, that relationship that you gain in patient experience makes the difference between outcome and no outcome. And fundamentally important, your accountability for the quality of that experience, the mutual respect and relationship and trust in that relationship. Then communications, the fourth pillar there, is about educating your clients and advising and coaching and counseling. It's not about doing as you're told, it's actually about having a meaningful exchange and engagement. Resources is both about technology and people, and it's about deploying and managing the right skilled people and tools to achieve the goals. And be recognized that as the authorized autonomous practitioner, you are accountable for what happens when you use those tools, what happens when you delegate to people within your team. Your strategic accountability has got to be about clarity of purpose. It's got to be about the values and the way you live the values. But in a world of dramatic change brought about through technology and consumer attitudes, strategic accountability is about how you adapt and adopt intelligently to the changes that are on the horizon, and that you prepare for them, and that you don't get afraid of them, and you certainly don't bury your head in the sand because the world is changing. You are accountable. Your accountability is about making sure that if you are going to continue focusing on the best possible outcomes, you need to know what technology and regulation and other things are doing. And of course, all that comes back to your learning in your CPD and your reflection on what's happened, your audit of what happened, your commitment to your own and your team's CPD. So the 7 pillars remain just as important, but they have to be interpreted in the context of your authorization and accountability as a practitioner who is authorized for unsupervised action. And when we come back to Moore's triangle again, how do we translate that for audiologists, independent sector audiologists, hearing aid dispensers? The public value proposition is about your wholehearted commitment that I know all of you got to helping your clients to live well, engage in community, have meaningful relationships in work and family life. The operational capability is about your training, your experience, your professional skill, and maintaining and working within your scope of practice and the practice of scope of others that you're working with. And the authorizing environment is about the role of HCPC, giving you the right to autonomous practice, but recognizing that that autonomous practice gives you responsibilities and consequences for those responsibilities, that you are absolutely, totally on the hook for everything that your other clinical staff do. No wriggle room. You can't get out of it. You are responsible. So if you've got hearing care assistants, making sure that they only work within the scope of their training, your responsibility. Observing occasionally, making sure they are practicing to the best standards, because you are the one whose job is on the hook if they get it wrong. So the strategic triangle of the value proposition, the operational capacity, and the authorizing regime is just as valid for your clinical governance as it is for corporate organizations and big picture stuff. And finally, clinical governance, as you reflect further on what I said and what I've introduced, recognize the authority of your regulation. Hearing aid dispensers are almost unique in the regulatory environment that you operate in, and what that means personally to you and to your clients. Use it well. That gives you power And as I've said time and again, governance is about choosing how you exercise that power well. I talked about stuff and style. Can't resist bringing that back in again. Focus on the stuff and the style. It's not enough just to do good process. It's about the way, the manner, the ethos, the values that you demonstrate, the behaviors as you achieve that. And transparency and accountability. Be absolutely crystal clear about how you're going to share and open your clinical books so that others can see. And if you're in the NHS, then candor is the word that springs to mind in here. That's a fundamental part of transparency and accountability. Pet topic of mine, never cease to be curious and keen to learn. If you've had the stuffing of excitement at learning new things knocked out of you, you ain't going to be good at clinical governance. And if you want to hold it all to yourself, then actually clinical governance is about enhancing not only your own skills and experience, but the profession and your colleagues and the network. You can't go it alone, because as a professional, you have a duty to be relating to the body of knowledge of your profession, the network of your peers, and helping them and being accountable to them as well. And bottom line is, clinical governance for a hearing aid dispenser regulated for autonomous practice, nothing to do with organizations and processes and excuses from somebody else. It's absolutely 100% about you. Understand it, live it, breathe it, own it, and never cease to enjoy the fabulous experiences and lives that you restore. That's what clinical governance is. It's an excitement. It's about being the governante, the cabinantes, the steersman, the cox, the person facing the future, the one who is harnessing all the power at your disposal. All those models that come from the history and etymology of governance and cybernetics that sits well. So that's my stopping point, and I do apologize for getting broken in the middle, but that's where we're up to. Now,
thank you very much. Well done in cruising through that hip in the middle with technical difficulties. I'm not seeing any questions pertaining to the presentation as of yet. We'll wait a few more minutes to see if people want to jump in. In the meantime, I'll ask one myself, and it's in relation to what you actually mentioned. I've got a background in the NHS, so I know in relation to the controlling part, which is exactly what you're saying this is not about. You did mention that clinical governance is about creating freedom, not controlling, within boundaries and also with consequences. The question is, and perhaps if we frame it in relation to domiciliary visits, which are carried out by hearing aid dispensers, who is the organization, body, who actually monitors the fact that clinical governance is being carried out and uptaken by hearing aid dispensers?
That's a very significant and important question, because there is, if I go back to, and I'm always going to refer back to the Hearing Aid Council and the world in which those who've been practicing for a long time were very familiar with the fact that the Hearing Aid Council told you precisely what and how to do stuff, what you could do, what you couldn't do, and they ruled the world with an iron fist. In many ways less scary than the current environment, but at the other extreme, had not an ounce of recognition of the role of being a professional. You did as you were told, end of story. And that's about as far removed from the world of a professional as you can get. The other extreme that we're at now is one in which the regulation, you are regulated, you are trained and regulated and authorized, and there is a kind of implicit assumption that as a professional you're a jolly good egg, or whatever language you want to use these days, that you are a person of integrity, that you live up to all the values of probity and integrity and ethics, morality, all of those things. And the accountability for that is kind of an accountability on the one hand to the profession, an accountability to your consumers, your clients, your patients, if you want to call them patients. But there's also, that's where the standard, the code of ethics and standards of the HCPC are about you being willing to stand up and be accountable for each other, and your duty to report anyone who, as a professional, who is not living up to those standards and misbehaving or whatever. And that's why when we look at the current claims about how we deliver value to our members, one of the things is that we're actually willing to act to be the tough, to deliver the tough love occasionally. Actually, we've got to uphold the standards of the profession, and where there are lapses, we have to do something about it. And you have to do that as well as practitioners. And the other side of that, and obviously HCPC checks that out in their audit processes and demands it through CPD and a whole bunch of things. HCPC is not particularly good at understanding the commercial environment, and that's where trading standards becomes the police, if you like. And we have a good relationship with trading standards, and they occasionally come to us for advice on the life and work of hearing aid dispensers. And it's kind of a fudge in many ways, but actually that's why I emphasize the vibrancy of clinical governance, because it's actually self-awareness, self-accountability is a very big part of the answer to that question. I know I've taken a long time to answer it, but actually it's not about a bunch of police hanging over you. It's about that self-discipline and so on. And if you look at the way CQC behaves with NHS organisations, the burden of regulation is one of the biggest complaints that comes out time and again, that resources that would be better put to delivering good quality care are invariably being used to tick the boxes that the policemen want to see. And that for me is not good governance, it's just covering your back. But that's my perspective on life.
Fair enough. Thank you for that answer. I mean, I always wondered whether it's better to actually be preventative than to be reactionary. But it seems that by not having that policing that you're actually referring to, and scrutinizing our practices and auditing exactly what we're doing and how we're doing on a regular basis, not just as a police tool, but also to actually improve our clinical standards and effectiveness and efficiency in how we deliver our services. It seems that the profession is kind of waiting for that reactionary behavior from somebody doing a malpractice to then change that particular aspect of what we're doing and how we're doing it. And it seems to me that that's perhaps not the best way forward. But again, I don't see how that can actually be solved. I mean, in fact, there is a question here from Bernard Hayes. It says, could you further describe scope of practice as it relates to earwax removal? And she's saying specifically microsection. She goes on to say, someone goes on a day course and suddenly is able to remove wax by microsection without supervision. Are you able to, comment on this in relation to clinical governance? Are we waiting for that one hearing aid dispenser to actually perforate an eardrum, make somebody bleed because of hearing loss, get a reaction from patient, provide tinnitus after microsection, for us to then have to envisage or scrutinize how we actually allow hearing aid dispenser to practice ear microsuction?
That's a good open-ended question in many ways, isn't it? The bottom line is that wax removal is not regulated in any way, and even though it might be one of the more risky elements of the audiologist practice in some ways, and so it can be done by anyone, often done by nurses, often done by, used to be done in GP clinics, and so on, wide variety of people. And what's the quality of the training? What's the sign-off? This is where the responsibility and accountability of the professional, the regulated professional, comes to the fore, because if you, as a hearing aid dispenser, employ someone and delegate a task to them, you are accountable for the outcome that they achieve, even if that outcome is beyond your own regulation, because you have, in the world of hearing care, you have consulted a patient or client, you have referred them to someone, and you should only refer them to people with known skills, competence, scope of practice, etc. And if in referring them, you refer them to someone who is not competent or has not got enough experience, you are accountable for what happens. If they go directly to that individual with only 1 day's training, then there is no equivalent accountability, because but the really tough question in there is, how is that person doing microsuction? How are they getting liability insurance? What's the insurance company doing in giving them insurance cover for a practice which is not necessarily proven, not regulated, and so on? So if you, as a audiologist, are employing someone to do it, one of the selling points that you can make is that it is regulated because of your own registration. If your team does it, it is not regulated and protected if someone else does it. So, it's a bizarre situation, but that is the reality.
That's fair enough. I suppose we're talking about clinical governance, and you did mention that it's very much in relation to the framework, accountability, safeguarding of high standards, and excellent clinical care. Microsuction is perhaps one of those that, because it's not regulated, it's still, and I know I'm going to be accountable for if something did happen to the client or patient that I'm actually seeing. How can, or which society will ensure that the safeguarding of high standards is taking place, and that the excellence in the clinical care when it comes to oral microsuction, for example, is being scrutinized?
Just before I answer that, I'll just explain to the audience that I put up the final slide up, which was for those who might want to leave early or whatever, that upcoming dates, which just a plug for it. We're looking for the December webinar to look at the new world of digital VAT regulation, which changes in April. Haven't yet got a speaker, not guaranteeing that, but that will be, I think, a very important topic. We've just marketed to you the collaborative event in March in Bristol between ourselves, BSHAA and BSHAA, and you heard it first here. Dates almost guaranteed, June 21st, 22nd in Coventry. The Friday series of intensive workshops, no exhibition this year, the conference and exhibition on the Saturday. More will be coming out in the near future, but hold the dates. Now I'll come back to the question, give people a chance, recognizing it's 8 o'clock and people may wish to be leaving. Come back to your question, which you probably need to remind me what the question was, because I didn't write it down. You were remind me again, Raoul.
It was purely about basically a conversation that we've had and council members in regards to accreditation of perhaps courses and how we're going to perhaps look at what's being provided out there and differentiate between an accredited course and one that may just get CPD points as opposed to be accredited. Do you want to comment on that in regards to clinical governance?
Sure. There is a confusion of language out there, and there was also a confusion of CPD points and what it means and relates to the fellowship discussion and so on. And indeed, HCPC does not demand points. It just demands that you do a certain amount of continuing professional development. And in my view of continuing professional development, the important thing is that you reflect upon your practice, you understand where your strengths are and seek to build on the strengths, and you understand where your weaknesses are and seek to do something about it. So the CPD, the continuing professional development, which should focus on continuous improvement in outcomes, should be directed by your self-awareness and your self-review and your peer reviews, so that you are actually investing in things which are genuinely going to change your practice for the better. That's how you should focus on CPD. And of course, no organisation like BSHAA can determine what is the appropriate CPD for your needs and so on. So there's an element in which we will continue to offer recognition that events, activities which are potentially contributing to professional development should be noted, but there is an element in which we should, as a professional body, be saying, actually, in the world of microsuction, these are the 2-3 bits of training which are absolutely essential, and courses that contain these absolutely essential ingredients to the right standard, we will do more than give some points for attendance. We will give some form of kite mark of approval that says this is a good course. This meets the needs of the profession to enable people to move forwards. We haven't yet managed to bridge exactly how we're going to achieve that, short of large quantities of resource, which clearly we haven't got. But we are struggling with moving towards a position where we will recognise 2 distinct types of CPD, ones that are just an acknowledgement that something has happened, which may or may not be good, but is likely to have contributed somehow, assuming you've done the necessary reflection on it, and others where we're actually saying we think this is contributing significantly to the advancement of the profession, and therefore it comes with a higher recommendation. And that's something, it'll take us some time to work that through, but that's the direction we're wanting to go in.
Raoul, can I ask a question from David?
Of course.
It's a more basic one, David. You alluded to whistleblowing and how HCPC's developed guidance on whistleblowing rather recently, last year, I think. It's more from governance point of view. What do you think about the scenario where you find that one of your colleagues might not have done the best thing for their patient? Let's take an example of wax removal. If somebody's either damaged the ear during the wax removal or caused an infection by using a technique that wasn't appropriate for them, and you see that client in your clinic, and you know that the previous professional, whether it was an audiologist or somebody else who's ever seen them, have not done the right thing by them, but the client or the patient themselves, they are not willing to take it any further. So how do you play that scenario, and what is the responsibility of the person seeing that particular client in the clinic?
I think this is this is really, really hard. and I think it's really hard because it's a situation that occurs all over the place. It's not unique to audiology. It occurs all over the place. And,
Yeah.
The bottom line is, if you allow someone to continue practicing without challenge, who is running risks that are putting their patients or clients at risk, which is not properly shared with them and not properly managed, then you are encouraging the failure of your own profession. If, on the other hand, you challenge that behavior in an inappropriate way and without checking out the facts, you are potentially ruining someone's career on say so, loose evidence, whatever it is. And if you challenge them, and it's appropriate to challenge them, but there is a power relationship which harks back to what I was saying about failures in governance, then you're equally running a risk in your own career, because people hold grudges in this kind of world around whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is probably one of the most dangerous things you can do in life, as happens time and time again. So it's an enormous dilemma. And I think the only thing I come back to is my penultimate slide, the one where I set out, these are the characteristics of clinical governance in the world of a professional, in which it's all about you, your behaviors, your attitudes, your actions. And actually, I've seen, for me, there is a very clear, you've got to understand what your accountability is. You've got to understand I talked earlier about boundaries and freedoms and consequences. And I think you've got to be very, very clear in your own mind where your own red line sits. And under no circumstances do you allow anyone to push you over that line. And sometimes, and this in the corporate governance world, this is a dreadful state of affairs. That red line moves like crazy when people become threatened. And I'm very clear, and always have been very clear in my career, that I know where my red line is, and the minute I get pushed or tried to persuade to go across that line, my proper result is to resign. And I've done it once, and I did it because I was being pushed in a world which was completely inappropriate and false to my values and false to my professional values. And when that line starts to drift, it's really, really, really unhealthy for the profession, for everyone around it. And this is where governance for me is fundamental. I talked about failures of governance and weakness of governance and people not understanding and being pushed and power struggles going on. I think the biggest failure in here is people not actually understanding what accountability means and not being prepared to be accountable when the crunch comes. So it's a personal choice for me, because there is a moral dilemma in there. There is no right answer. It's a matter of choosing between a bunch of wrong answers, or some less wrong than others, if you like. But if you are totally and utterly clear about your own value system, your own commitment to your own profession, where you are, what you are want to be held aloft for, I think you make the decision in that light, in a way which is much more powerful than anybody giving you a formula to look up.
Yeah, so I understand the moral aspect of it, and if I can just extend it a little bit, because it is an important question which in real world pops time and again. So, I have a group of friends who are audiologists, and we talk every now and then about different things, technology, and this sort of issues come up. So I guess I understand what you just said, and I completely agree with that. What I'm trying to ask is, and if I can put it this way, it's really difficult to go against the will of a patient, in a sense. So if they say that we don't want to take it any further, it's really time-consuming process in itself, the whistleblowing. And then if you do not have any evidence to back it up, then you are just, probably hitting a wall with your head, if you like. I guess what I'm trying to ask here is that if such a thing comes to you, let's say in your customer care scheme group, and if somebody says that Jay did not report this person and he knew about this practice from this patient, so can I sort of, from regulatory and from the society's point of view, defend myself by saying that the patient didn't want it, so I couldn't disclose it?
I'm going to hedge again, I think, because it really is difficult. But I would say the right course of action for you under those circumstances, and it's a hard, difficult course of action, but the right course of action, if you've got no evidence, you've got nothing to report. If the patient doesn't want to take it any further, you've got nothing to do at one level. But actually, an informal conversation directly with the individual concerned to say, I was surprised, I was surprised about this, whether any, can we talk about it? As a very informal, off the record conversation, which kind of, with a responsible clinician, should start that process of self-reflection and act as a trigger to think afresh. I'd like to think that was a balanced approach to take.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, I think it's
easy to say and hard to do. I know, but
yeah, I think that's outside the whistleblowing purview, though. When you talk to the individual, so I can understand your moral and clinical and professional responsibilities, but it's really a regulatory dilemma for some people. So I haven't been in that situation, but I'm just reiterating somebody else's experience, and I couldn't tell them anything better than what we've discussed here.
But I think the concept of whistleblowing, whistleblowing, you're supposed to be protected as a whistleblower, but actually the protection is almost worthless at one level. And whistleblowing based on anecdote and hearsay is extraordinarily dangerous, because you've no idea what happens, what the circumstances were, and you can set hairs running, which is why I think that informal conversation, unless you've got real hard evidence, in which case whistleblowing is a very different thing if you've got hard evidence. I think you've got that informal conversation, professional coaching, mentoring, however you want to describe it, and actually having some form of clinical audit, informal conversation about, just reflecting on what happened in a particular situation. Say, is there any learning to be found from here? I think that's something to really strongly encourage amongst teams.
Sure. Right. The other question that I wanted to ask, if I may.
We're on time here, Jay.
We are a little bit behind schedule. But,
I'll take it offline then.
So, fire, Jay. Why don't you go for it? I'm sure it won't be too long.
Well, again, from the perspective of colleagues, one of the things that comes up is, and some of my colleagues are like me who work for NHS and who work in the private sector as well. When you look at the governance model within the NHS audiology review, in terms of the education and training that you need to have is not only audiology related, but also things like manual handling and safeguarding, which you have to keep updating yourself every year. Clinical auditing is one of the other main thing that some of the colleagues may not be doing as regularly as if I were in a governed model per se, will be recommended. So how do you look at those things from private practice point of view? Do you think that those are the things that all the hearing and dispensing businesses should put in place for the dispensers and other staff? So the mandatory training every year and clinical auditing for the core stuff that we do there, those sort of things.
I think part of it relates to the size of organisation in which you work, not whether it's NHS or independent sector. Some of it's to do with size of the organisation, and some of it's to do with the reach and visibility and accountability to the directors, those in the organisation who are ultimately accountable, and they have to have line of sight of certain things. So if you're running a one person or a very small team private practice, you know what's going on, you know what's important, and so you know, things like diversity, safeguarding training, and various things like that, I think are kind of more important to think about hard than things like manual lifting, for instance, which you know what you're doing in your practice. You know whether you need any training. You know whether you need to know how to use a fire extinguisher or whatever it is. You know that. In a very small business, some of those things, it's overkill to kind of, and it's box ticking to say you've got to do them. In bigger organisations, it's actually much more about ensuring that those who those who are accountable for whether it's done or not, and remember that corporate responsibility is based on size of turnover and things, so you can be fined, you know, failure to do important health and safety things. The risks that you take are based upon the size of the organisation, because the fines of that are related to turnover and so on. So you have to have more mechanisms in place when you are when your staff, frontline staff, are further away from those who are ultimately accountable and responsible. So some of that is about size of organisation, and I would expect in your Specsavers, your hidden hearings, your Bootses, that some of that would be just as much expected as in the NHS, whereas in a small practice it wouldn't be. So and again, there is an element to that, though, in bigger organisations, of outsourcing your personal self-accountability to the organisation rather than actually looking after it for yourself. And there's an element in which I get uncomfortable about professionals being told what to do rather than thinking it for themselves. You see what I mean?
Sure.
I think it's up to individual a very important element of clinical governance for independent practitioners is about understanding what matters and doing the right thing. And again, woolly words in many ways, but actually that's what being a professional is about.
That's very clear.
Thank you very much. That's great, David, and I think it's a very good point to end the webinar tonight. Thank you for your presentation. We hope everybody enjoyed your presentation, and apologies again to all about the difficulty that we've experienced throughout tonight. We hope to see you all on the 12th of December for our next webinar. Good night, and thanks again, David. All the best.
Thanks very much, folks. Thank you to everyone, and happy to get some feedback from you, and apologies that it disappeared in the middle.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.